Oh, okay, so we are here to talk about associated docs today, and I am going to start out the class, as I always do, with a really exciting video. So it's about 4 minutes long, but it is worth it because it really explains what I am going to try to be teaching you today. So with your permission, let's get it up on the screen. There we go. Oh, hold on. I got to share the sound.
Hi, welcome back to another edition of Mic Drops. I'm your host, Richie Averill, and I'm joined today with Shanavi Johnson with Dora.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about a very great topic today, HOAs.
Everyone's favorite topic. Yay!
Absolutely. So for anyone that might be watching, what is an HOA and what does that encompass?
So an HOA is kind of the overarching terminology that we use. Really what it is any community that provides services to the homeowners, such as trash removal, snow removal, lawn maintenance, or just general maintenance. But the legal term is common interest community. And so while your association may not be called an HOA, it would still fall under a common interest community if it provides any sort of services to the homeowners. And that's what an HOA is.
Okay, thank you. So for a future home buyer that might be looking to buy in an HOA, what are some things they should know before buying that home?
So the number one thing you're going to want to know are the restrictions that an HOA has. A lot of HOAs here in Colorado restrict renting, short-term rentals for those of us that love Airbnb, as well as pet restrictions. So you're going to want to know if your HOA or the one you're thinking about purchasing into has those types of restrictions.
Okay, good to know. And so what about if this home that they're looking to buy happens to have a violation or potentially have a violation with the HOA? Is there a way that this potential home buyer could find that out before buying?
So generally speaking, what you're going to want to look at is the status letter.
Okay.
Most sellers will provide that to the purchaser prior to them closing on the deal. However, if you don't receive one, you can always ask the seller to get one from the association or speak to the association yourself and ask if they have a status letter available.
Okay. And speaking of status letters, I've heard that sometimes a seller or a homeowner can get that status letter for free, yet if a buyer or potential buyer needs to get one, there's a charge for that. Is that true?
So it depends on the association. Generally speaking, the seller can get that for free,
okay,
or the association may charge. However, if you're the purchaser, you will always have to pay for that. So if you can work with your seller, you can get that for free.
All right, good to know. So speaking of that, kind of going along with that question, what are some things a seller should do before putting their home on the market if it's in an HOA?
So the number one thing I recommend sellers do is kind of gather all of those important documents that you're going to want your purchaser to have. These are going to be your governing documents, such as your bylaws or covenants, meeting minutes, financial records, and of course that status letter. Those things, getting them together will make the process so much easier, not only on yourself but on your buyer as well. And then it gives them the opportunity to make sure that that's where they want to purchase a home in, especially if those restrictions don't match up with what they're wanting.
I can definitely say that having that information up front makes the process so much easier. Yeah. So what other tips or words of advice do you have for people looking to possibly buy a home in an HOA?
I think also just kind of showing what services that HOA provides. A lot of HOAs, do community events, block parties, they do community engagement events is great. I also would recommend just going around and speaking to some of the homeowners and asking their opinion on where they live. Do they like it? Do they like the board? Do they like the HOA, excuse me? How's the community manager? Are they easy to get in contact with? Do they respond regularly? All of these things are important to think about when you're purchasing into a new HOA.
Very good information. And we have quite a few HOAs in the state, am I right?
Yeah, there's about 9 million HOAs in the state of Colorado. So, somewhere around 5 million people live in HOAs.
So if you're watching this, there's a great chance that you're in an HOA.
Absolutely.
So HOAs don't have to be scary.
No, absolutely not. They should be, a community involved thing. They should be something that you look forward to living in and bringing up your property values, somewhere safe for you to live.
I love it. Great information. Shanavi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great time.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
There we go. Okay. So that's the basics of it. So if you caught it, then she was talking about that it's just because it's not called an HOA, you're still going to be wanting to treat whatever kind of community organization there is, and as it has to do with a contract, right? So I hear a lot and have over the years where people are like, well, it's not really an HOA. I'm like, I know, but we still need all the documents for that. So now let me go ahead and show you. Let me get out of this. We're going to go to the contract. And like I had said, this is just because we're recording this is a Colorado only class, this is the Colorado contract. This is the part of the contract that we're talking about, section 7. Okay, I wanted to talk about why, so this is in bold, and the way, let's first talk about how, sorry, I haven't done this class in a little while. Wanted to talk about how you explain this to a buyer. Well, you have put together the offer and you are going to explain it to the buyer. And the way I used to do it, again, I'm out of practice. It's been a good 5 years since I've sold property, but this part that's in bold, so you're going through all this boilerplate stuff in the contract, and you do want to explain everything about the contract. It used to take me at least about 45 minutes to go through the entire contract with someone. Even if they wanted me to hustle through it, I want to explain what their rights and their obligations are as a buyer and like all the different ways you can get out of the contract. But you get to this and you've been through pages of pretty much boilerplate where there's not much that the agent has written in there. You're still stopping here, you're pausing and you say, look, the reason this is in bold, this is all about the HOA and homeowners associations, anything to do with common interest communities, which is what we used to call it in the contract, CICs, common interest communities. The reason this is in bold is because you happen to be buying a house in an HOA. Let's say it's Hillcrest Apartments, or so you have like single family homes that happen to be in an HOA, or you're talking about some townhomes or some condos. So you can't, after closing, stick up a red flag and decide that you don't want to be part of that HOA. If you purchase a property that's within an HOA, you are agreeing to abide by their rules and regulations. So you have a chance in the contract to go through all of that kind of stuff that exists. So here is a list of all the documents that pertains to. You have declarations, articles of incorporation, bylaws, the rules of the organization, party wall agreements if it's a condo, minutes to all the meetings that have happened recently. You have a list of insurance policies. You have a list of assessments, financial documents. So you have the right to look all this stuff over. And I gave you a whole week in the contract so that if you want to get an attorney to look them over and to help you advise you whether it's a financially viable organization, that you have a chance to do that, right? So it doesn't mean that the HOA that you are purchasing into has a copy of all these documents, like reserve study is an example. There are some condos out there that there's one up at Purgatory, Cascade Village. They've done 3 or 4 of these reserve studies over the years. So you're going to get a copy of all of that stuff. But there's other little HOAs that don't have much of these things, but you're still going to get everything that does exist. Does that make sense? So that's how I'm explaining it to the buyer. And then if you're talking to the seller, you want to just tell them this is when you're listing the property, we're going to go through a whole listing checklist that I've created based on all the people at Coldwell Banker down in Durango and all the checklists they've used over the years for sellers and for buyers. But my seller checklist for an example, it's got a whole like 2 pages worth of things that you want to make sure you ask the seller as you're listing the property, that you make sure you do when you're listing the property, right? Not like things that it's going to tell you anywhere else, just based on all the mistakes we've made here over the years, right? So on that list is you are trying to get this information as soon as you go get the listing so that they have it all in one place. I want to get the seller might not have these things, but the HOA definitely does. More and more, all these organizations are putting their things online, so they're in a really easy to reach place. Most HOAs now are getting professional managers because the rules are getting heavier and heavier to what they have to provide to people, right? But you're making sure that you're asking your seller. So I'm not going to give you the exact language that I'm asking the seller. It's on a checklist. Just know if I haven't taught you that class or you haven't seen the checklist yet, just ask me for it and I'll give it to you. Like Emmy, I know you don't have it yet. Crystal, I don't know if I've given it to you yet. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing with a seller. I'm just asking them, could you get me the name of your HOA contact so I can get these things? And then, are there any assessments planned? And they don't always know, okay? So one of the things that you're gonna be getting is a list of assessments. So I'm gonna stop sharing this for just a minute, but we're gonna go back to it in a second. When you have a seller, there are many times that it's a second home, third home, fourth home, fifth home in Colorado, or they could be somebody that they have a busy family and they don't see all the mail. My family, you don't see all the mail that comes in. So until you get the second or third notice, you just aren't really paying attention to those kind of things, even if it is your primary residence. So don't assume that the seller is, you're going to have surprises. Some sellers don't know all these things. If you ask a seller, do you have any assessments planned here at your HOA? Do not be surprised if you go and dig and ask the HOA the same question, that something comes up that they just didn't see the memo. It doesn't mean they're trying to hide anything. People are just busy. Emmy, were you trying to ask a question?
I'm wondering if it's acceptable to just put the link in the listing for the HOA docs versus scanning everything and uploading it into the documents section of the listing.
It is always acceptable to put the link so that people can access the documents. This has to do with if you're on the MLS link or you're sending it to the buyer. However, if you are trying to prove what you sent to the buyer, the link is probably going to expire and the link will change. So you can send a link to the buyer and say, here is, I checked with the HOA, these are all the current documents, and here's the link to them. But I think when you have a file, like for Dora, like what you need to provide in your file, they're probably going to want, I don't know anymore. If you keep the email that you sent a link and it shows what the link went to, then you're probably good Dora-wise. That shows I checked with the HOA, this was the date, and this is my email that I sent to them. I used to tell people to make sure you actually download those things so that you can prove what you sent to them. But as long as you're documenting the date you sent, and maybe I checked that the minutes you're seeing, these minutes were the most recent minutes. If you have a little documentation, that's probably enough for the file.
I'm actually talking about, I was actually just looking at another one in Falls Creek Ranch that just came up, and she actually just put, HOA documents available at www.fallscreekranchhoa.com.
And that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. But you're going to want, so if the seller's agent, always put it on yourself, no matter what side of the situation you're on, to do the other person's job. So if you might want to call the listing agent, if you think you're going to come across like a jerk, it depends on the personality of the other agent. If you don't want to bother them, then just do it yourself. But most of the time I'd call the listing agent if I'm on the buyer side, and I'd say, hey, did you possibly double check that those are the most recent minutes or not? But, even if I ask the listing agent, I'm still going to check on it myself. I still want to make sure that they're getting everything they need. So I will probably reach out to that HOA contact myself, which probably is an HOA management company. So they have their poop together, right? So they know that everything on there is supposed to be on there. Okay. That's fine if you're just providing that. So on the MLS, the link is just absolutely good. And I'm going to show you a couple reasons that the link is probably better than trying to download them. And then what if you make a mistake and you forgot to add this one? Like, it can get really hard, but you definitely want to document everything you are giving to the other person. So if they ever have a lawsuit where they go, I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to have horses, I have horses, you can somehow verify that you checked with someone that was the right one if you're on the seller side. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. So are there any assessments planned? The people don't always know when you're putting it in the MLS. So here's another one. When you're putting in the MLS that it's in an HOA, you want to be really specific about what is included. This is especially true in resort areas where you can have, and this is more of being helpful and making sure there's no misunderstandings, making sure someone right before closing doesn't want to just bail on the contract. So if you have I'm going to take an example of Purgatory Resort, which we are close to. So you're going to have 10 different HOAs that all have different things. So if you need to be able to compare apples to apples. So when I was a resort agent, I would have, and I was taught this by another resort agent, Phil Waymeyer, who's like one of my heroes. So he would have spreadsheets of all the different subdivisions and exactly what it costs to be a member of that subdivision and what it included. So if it didn't include it, he also knew how much it would cost you to get that service. So any kind of condo at a resort is going to, I cannot imagine it wouldn't include water, sewer, trash, right? Nobody's going to have to go take their trash somewhere. Roads probably, right? But then you think about all the things it takes you to have a resort property. You're going to need Wi-Fi. That can be 70, 80 bucks a month. And usually it's part of the HOA because it's cheaper for them to provide you with a service and then bill everyone for it, right? Cable, all these extra things cost so much money. And you can have, if you aren't a resort agent and you're going and you're showing your people property and you're reading it and the customer goes, oh my God, 550 bucks a month for this little studio. And then, well, maybe I'm going to buy this one that's 350 bucks a month. And then they close on it and realize it's actually more money for them to have the studio in the other place because it didn't include all these things. Just be really upfront. It's so helpful to be able to go show a listing and it just shows every single thing that's in there. And it's all in the, so it would be in the remarks section, you know, if there's no place for it in somewhere else, just put it all in the remarks section, say, this is what, and you can even write, this resort property includes all the things you might need in order to do this. Some resort properties include firewood. How cool is that? You can just go bring your little fire thing down and fill it with wood and then go bring it back to your house because they all have little, you know, they all have the little, what am I trying to say? Wood stoves. You have shuttles. Some of them include shuttles. Some of them have 2 HOAs. You're going to want to explain that. There's for us, there's a DMMA, so there's the Master Association, and then underneath it, there's the HOA. So what does each one do? You just want to be as helpful as possible. You never want to think, well, they should know that. Have it so easy to sell so that other agents want to come show your properties. So that's kind of how you want to do that. If there's an assessment, so assessment, what I'm trying to say is the HOA wasn't keeping enough money in reserve and all of a sudden they have to go and put an $8,000 assessment on every single property in the subdivision because they need enough money because they just had a horrible sewer leak or a water leak and they got to fix it and they didn't have the money and they don't want to have to go get a loan, right? That's an assessment. So usually these are things that were talked about in HOA meetings, they were voted on, or the people talk, you know, it doesn't always need a vote. It usually, I think the way it works in some of these subdivisions is it's just the board has to decide what has to be done. But usually you want to have people talk about it and they want to have a vote. So it'll be at the HOA meeting. So they're probably discussing it for a year or so. If they know about the issue, if it's an emergency, they might not. But by reviewing minutes, you're going to know about things that might not have been voted on yet, but they've been talking about over and over, and maybe it's been voted down. Those are kind of red flags that, oh, there might be something. They keep talking about this old elevator that they have to fix, those sort of things. But if there is an assessment, be very clear. It's a good market for sellers. Some days, some years, it's not a good market for sellers. So it's always dependent on what the market's doing, what kind of, how good your condo is. You know, like, is it really been well maintained, or is it really have to be redone as to how you're going to approach that in the MLS and in your listing? Maybe let's just keep talking about this $8,000 assessment. Does the buyer have to take this on at closing? Is the seller going to pay off the rest of the assessment? A lot of times what I used to see is the seller would just pay it off at closing. So the HOA might not say, oh, you have $8,000 due on 9/1. It might say, every month we're tacking on an extra 150 bucks until the assessment is paid off, or you can just pay it off, right? A lot of sellers and a lot of buyers would require the seller to just get that paid at closing, right? Unless it was intended for it to be a 2-year thing and then it's going to go back to a different price. Maybe the buyer's like, I don't care, I'll just take it on. You've been paying it for a couple of years. I'm going to now own the property, so I'll take it on. So it's always really highly negotiable. If you have a certain situation, come see me. But if it just depends on what the person's offering, it always depends on the situation, but make it super clear. Don't let anybody not know about an assessment, because there is nothing worse than anytime you have a misunderstanding in a contract, the buyer's going to always assume that, what else are you hiding? You didn't tell me about that. So just make sure it's everywhere. And you're always dealing with a least common denominator on the other side. Always assume that the other agent isn't noticing things. So don't just put it out there and then assume they saw it. you're going to want to follow up with an email if they put it under contract or they're about to write an offer. Note that there is an assessment we're still paying off on that. So you do want to check on those things, whether there are assessments planned, not just with your seller, because they don't always know, right? Oh, and they're not always right. So that's another thing about your sellers. They might say, oh, all the time. How many times does this happen? They say, oh, my dues are $243 a month. Okay, 243, that's a pretty exact number, so it must be right. And then maybe you're talking to the wife and the husband says, well, no, honey, that was like 3 years ago. It went up to this back then. And so just know that sellers are often incorrect, and they might remember the water bill being the one that the HOA is. So always double check what people are saying. Even if you're brand new in business and this person has bought and sold properties for uber years, just know that they could easily have misplaced a number. Okay. What is a status letter? So they got into it in the video. The status letter, so I'm on the board of a little tiny HOA. There's 12 units and it's an investment condo that I own. It's just a 1-bedroom condo. I've been sitting on the board for 5 years or so. The rules have really changed. It's called CCIOA. That is the name of the rule. You don't have to remember that, but you might have learned that in real estate school too. CCIOA are these governing documents from the state of Colorado that say, okay, all you HOAs out there have to do certain things to protect the person who lives in that subdivision. And what CCIOA did is, I think it's like 75 pages or 90 pages worth of documents about all the things you have to provide to people when they're buying and selling, or how many days notice and what you have to do for this kind of thing. And so at that point, you had a whole bunch of different mom and pop HOAs that said, I'm done. I feel like I'm probably on one of the last remaining. We have 2 realtors, Thad Trujillo and I are helping run the board, right? So we have 2 realtors on the board. So we felt like, oh my God, we don't want to up the price by hundreds of dollars a month for people. We'll just keep running it. But almost all of the rest of them put their hands up and said, I can't do this anymore. It's just too much liability for me to keep running this board. So they've given them to property management companies to run the HOAs, which for a lot of people actually worked out well. Because now you have this management company that you can get the correct documents. I had one situation years ago where the board member was out of town for 6 months and they had no phone and nobody knew how to reach them. So we had to close without getting the documents, and we had to just trust that what the seller was telling us and we had put in writing was correct. And we couldn't collect any money at closing because that person was out of town. Like, it was terrible. Like, do you write them a letter in Florida? Like, you don't really know how to reach this person. No one knows their address. Those kind of things have gone away because there's a structure where they'll get in trouble if they keep doing this. But it also has made it a lot harder for people because now the buyer can't just go call. You used to be able to just call a person and say, hey, you're on the board. Can you get me these documents? That's how it works with me. We had a status letter I had to do last week. And yes, I missed the email for a few days, but they tracked me down. It's not hard to reach me. And they said, we need that status letter. Oh, okay, I'll get it done. But what stinks about it now is that a lot of times you're calling the property management company and they don't want to talk to the buyer. They don't want to talk to the agent. They're only going to talk to the seller. Like, I don't talk to you. Or they don't even return your call and they don't tell you they don't want to talk to you. So there's all sorts of really like annoying things having to do with these companies, especially in Durango, that you just have to deal with now because it's the way it is. But the status letter is 1 or 2 page documents. I wish I should have just brought the one that I just did last week. And it is when you are going under contract, it is this piece of paper that will always go to the bank if you're getting a loan. But it also should go to the buyer, even if it is a cash deal that says, this is signed by an HOA board member that says, this is the amount of the assessment every month. This is exactly what it includes, right? This is how much the person has paid that seller, and they are late on their dues by 3 months. And so we put a lien on their property or whatever it is that they have done. It's all in a piece of paper, and it's 2 pages of like just explaining everything about the HOA. And then that goes to the closing company. It would go to the buyer and to the buyer's agent, and it goes to the lender. And that way they can make a settlement statement. So the title company will require this quite a while before closing. The lender's going to want it pretty quickly, but it's one of those things you get during the time you're under contract. It's not usually right away, but once, it's sort of around inspection time that you get the status letter. So just know there is a status letter. You need to know who to reach out to get it. If you are either on the buyer or seller side and you're trying to figure out who is the HOA contact, again, if you ask the seller, that's great. Maybe they know, but it could be somebody like me who's been on the board for years and years. Falls Creek is another one. It might be the same person who's been on that board for 15 years. I don't know. But there's other, so even if you have a property management company, you still need a board. Okay. So they manage the association for the board. So you're going to want both, right? But just know that whether you are on the buyer or seller side, if your seller doesn't know who to call, then your first call would be to the title company. The title company is going to have a guy or girl who knows how to reach each HOA if they're a good title company. Yes, as the man said on the video, there are millions of HOAs in Colorado, but your title company should know the names and the numbers of almost all of them. Sometimes they change over the years and they have an old information for it, especially as it comes to road maintenance agreements, not road maintenance, what would you call it? There's like, if you sell a property on a rural road, you might have like 10 neighbors that got together and actually have a document that formed some sort of organization structured loosely like an HOA. So yes, your title company might not have the number for that person, but your first call, if it's like Falls Creek or something major, just call the title company. They know that information. So you don't have to like sit there struggling. I don't know how to reach this HOA. Just the guy's name used to be Tom Loke over at Land Title, and I don't know who it is at CTS. They can look that up. And if they don't know, just call the other title company and just say, hey, did you have a number for them? There's nothing wrong with that. Even if you're not using them, they might be able to throw you that and help you out. Okay, so that's the status letter. That's why it's important, so that you actually know how much money it is. And yes, once in a while, it's incorrect. So even though you thought you checked on the price and you put it in the MLS, just know if you have it wrong, there's a good chance the buyer will say, well, make it right to me. I want you to pay the difference for 2 years. That stuff happens too. Okay, so let's say you get this link and it goes to a website somewhere. I used to just assume that the link was correct. So let me tell you how this works. So if you have a property management company, so super reputable company, I'm going to use DMMA as an example. They run a lot of the associations up at PERG. So DMMA, this is the local information. They are a master association that runs, they do like roads and they do a shuttle to the resort and they have like a club and they have activities. So it's sort of like the HOA above the HOAs of all these places that you can live, these condos and the single family residences and stuff. So DMMA is an entity as itself that does stuff, but they also serve as a property management group for a lot of those little HOAs. Okay. So that's why it's confusing. You're like, well, DMMA is that organization that runs the shuttles and the resort stuff. Why would they be also the ones that you go to for Engineer Village or like these associations, right? So just know when you have this very put together organization, they have a website where you're going, wow, it sure looks like they have everything up on their website. So you send someone a link and you go, oh, that's all the information I have. It might not be accurate. So it's not that it's not accurate, it's accurate. They might not have the most current information. So as a listing agent, I'm going to peruse the meeting minutes, right? And if I notice all the meeting minutes are 6 months apart and then they're missing like this director's meeting because you have the board meets and then you have the annual meeting where all the people meet, right? So you're going to look at all these and it says this all in the contract. You can see in the contract, it's going to explain this. And on my checklist, it's going to have a list of all these things that you're going to ask for. Okay. So in one of these, I think it's right here. So here's the status letter you can get. It talks about the financial statements somewhere. Tell me if you see it. This is insurance. Here it is. The annual owners or members meeting and the executive board or managers meetings. That's how you know there's different, right? So let's say you notice the annual meeting should have happened. It's June now. The annual meeting should have happened in March. Why is that not up? The only one I see is for like a year and a few ago. And then the executive board meetings stop at January. So why is that? So you want to call this organization and say, I might be wrong, but it seems like I'm missing something. And what they'll usually say is, yes, those minutes aren't approved yet. So does it make sense you have this annual meeting and then the people have to get together the following year to vote on the minutes? So they're not going to put it up on the website until it was approved, right? So if you're on the buyer side or the seller side, you're going to want to call the organization, the HOA president or this organization that's running the HOA and say, hey, I'm noticing on your website that you're missing a couple of things. I think, I could be wrong, but I think you are. And if they say, yeah, those are in draft form, we have it here, but they haven't been approved, so we didn't put it on the website. Say, could I get a copy of those things? Because there's probably a lot of information in there that your buyer's going to want to see. Like, we are about to put an assessment into place. So just because it's on the link, make sure you check into it, because I found, especially up at PERG, that happens a lot. They want to do things right. They want to do things perfectly. So they're not going to put it on the website until it's all approved. Does that make sense? It's really confusing, but you definitely want to make sure that's all there. But what will be accurate are the financials. I've never seen it where it wasn't. So they create financials in the annual meeting. And let's say, like for SoCo, the one I run, our annual meeting is in April, and we vote right there on the information, the financials for the year. So they go right up on the website because you just voted on them. They don't wait a year to vote on the financials. So that's I've never had to check on those. Those are accurate, but you are gonna get financials. So check online that everything's there. Keep a copy of what was sent to the buyers. So anytime you're on either side, you always, as an agent, I hope you know this, but if you weren't taught this, you need to back up all your emails and all your texts. You have to back all these things up and keep them in a file. The state says you have to keep it for 4. The way our office always did it was before distinctive. So I can't remember what their rule is now. I almost think it's 6 years or so. The state says you have to have it for 4. I always kept it for 10 years. There's 2 reasons I would do that. I would keep it for in case the person wanted to relist and I was looking for something, right? But I also want to keep it in case I'm sued. 4 years is really the limitation to having a contract issue where they can come back and sue you for it, but there's no limitation on fraud. So if somebody thinks that you committed fraud, they can go back a long time from now and sue you for it. So I always kept my information for a long, long time. And when it's email, there are programs for it. I just used to keep all my emails in a place. There's all sorts of apps for that now. They go in a file and then I keep them separated, not like in your inbox. You keep them separated in the person's file. It's the same with texting. Never delete a text because this could really save you in court. So you want to keep a copy of what was sent to the buyers when you're on the seller side, so that if they ever say you didn't send them something, very often it's in the buyer's agent's inbox. Okay, so you sent it to them and it never got to the buyer. So that's usually the source of the problem when there is a problem with that sort of stuff, but you want to keep a copy of all your emails, especially I would load it right into IQ because you want to prove that you sent everything to them on file. So just dump it all in IQ, keep a copy for yourself, and make sure you keep those emails. So what I do on the buyer side is I want to make sure that they have the opportunity to seek an attorney's advice, a real estate attorney's advice. And in our contract, we're always supposed to say before anyone signs anything, if you need, it's right at the top of the contract, if you want to get legal advice or an accountant's advice, do it before you sign anything, because once you sign something, you can't, if there was a mistake that your attorney says, well, I can't believe you signed that, it's too late, right? But the other time I always get an attorney involved is when I'm reviewing title work and then when I'm reviewing HOA docs. This doesn't mean people take me up on the offer, but I always have it come out of my mouth and then I always write it down. So we get the HOA docs and I say that I've already prepped them when we're doing the offer and we get it under contract. I say, okay, I have a little email or a letter that goes to them that says when we get our title work, when we get the association docs, I will ask you if you want to get an attorney. So I've prepped them for that then, and I have a copy of that letter. So it's called congratulations, you're under contract. So it kind of outlines all the things they're going to have to check on, right? So I can get that to you if you want. But what I do is when I get these association docs, I always have given them 7 days to look these things over. Doesn't mean it takes 7 days. It means I don't want to be standing in court one day and have my buyer say, well, she didn't give us time to look at these. I couldn't get an attorney. She only gave me 3 days. I see a lot of people putting just 3 days in their contract for people to look over the association docs. I say get them really quickly, give them a whole week so that they have the opportunity to get that attorney if they want to. So here's the conversation. We get the association docs. I say, remember how I talked to you about if you want to get an attorney, attorneys are really great to look over all these documents and be able to advise you whether you should go ahead with a purchase, whether the HOA is actually financially viable. And they say, really? Okay, well, I guess whatever. I've had only one person in my, like, what was it, like 15, 16, 17 years of selling that ever took me up on that. In all those contracts, it was the awesomest experience. So we sent it all. I had a list. I always give a list of real estate attorneys. Again, for the Durango area, I have that. So I sent him a list of attorneys. And this was, of course, it's a NASA engineer. So he's like, really wants to do everything by the book. And he got this attorney, and it wasn't even, you know how like attorneys are $300, $400 an hour. This was, what is it called? It's a legal assistant. So he had the legal assistant, which was a lot cheaper. Like the whole thing was like $175 that he paid. They looked over the whole financials of the HOA and wrote him a report about, you know, they don't have a lot of money in the bank, but seems like it's pretty good. I put that letter in my file, and this guy felt great about buying in the HOA. Like, what a relief to not have to deal with that myself and to feel like he actually got advice. So I was really shocked with how cheap it was and that they really did a good job. So if you have somebody that's nervous, or you have somebody like a NASA engineer, he wasn't NASA engineering, he was a government, he was a US like government engineer. So if you have anybody like that, that's that kind of brained and wants to get extra information, know that it's not that expensive to get someone to look at it, but you do need the time in there. And the way you do it, so let's say somebody takes you up on it and they say, okay, I want an attorney. So the way you do it, if you're helping them, if they're the person that wants you to handhold them, you just start calling that list of attorneys and see who has time for you, like today or tomorrow, okay? You're gonna have 8 people and you call them all and everybody goes, I'm too busy, I'm working on this big case. And there's gonna be that one person that goes, I can do it today. So that's the person you hire. So make sure your list of attorneys is a good one. And then you just tell your client, like, look, I'm just looking for anyone that can go over this. These are all real estate attorneys that my office has used in the past. Does that all make sense?
Do you have a list, Heather?
I have a list of all those things.
Okay.
So I'm gonna make a list right now. So attorneys, I'll do the contract letter, and then anything else I've mentioned, let me know. And I'll show you the checklist too. I'll send you the checklist. Do you have those things yet, Crystal?
I might have a copy of the checklist, but I
Okay.
definitely don't have
But
a
not
copy
the
of the
others.
attorney.
Okay, sounds good. I'll get those to you. So red flags. If you have a customer, listen to your customers always. Write down notes when you're showing property. I always wrote notes. Oh, these people have a dog. They want a fence. They want an underground fence. Any of those things that they talk about. Oh, they want a hot tub. Oh, wouldn't this be great, honey? We could sit out here and have a hot tub. What are other things? They want a horse. Any of these things, they have something in their family. The dog, the reason it's important is they're moving into a condo and you don't know if they're allowed to have dogs. If anybody's ever looking for a condo or a townhome, always ask, do you have pets and how many and how big are they? Because there could be rules that you can have a dog up to 40 pounds and not over that. Like there are so many rules in different HOAs. So those are kind of red flags. I am not the person that reads covenants to find out if there's a dog that's allowed in it, right? So you have some of these old covenants. So let's say the condo's been around since the 70s, and you have a little old lady that's moving into the condo that doesn't really know how to read covenants. And you're like, oh my God. So you'll have the old covenants from the 70s, and then they were redone in the 80s and then the 90s. And then, so you have like all these covenants and they all amended the old covenant, right? So you got to look at the old one, see if you found it. Then look at the new one, see how they changed it. So this thing can change over the years. Oh, all of a sudden pit bulls aren't allowed. All of a sudden, like this kind of dog isn't allowed. Oh no, they changed it back and now you can do it again. Or there's condos where you have, you can only have so many animals, or you can only have 2 of this and 3 of that, or a combination of this. You can't breed animals. There's others where the tenants can't have animals, but the owners can. There are condos. I had a problem up when I was a manager up at Perg. There are condos, like not timeshares, fractionals. There's a big sign in the building that said pets allowed. However, there are pets allowed. Everybody's allowed to have dogs, except for the fractional owners, because you own only a fraction of the property. You don't own the whole thing. So it wouldn't be fair to that person if they're allergic to animals to have this owner allowed to bring dogs in. Like, who knew? So even though the sign says dogs allowed, I totally made a mistake and almost got to closing with somebody that had a dog. Like, there's so many rules. Don't ever assume. So the way I did it is I would peruse. If I had the little old lady, if it was anybody else, I wouldn't do it. But you look at the covenants and you kind of, oh, it says something here about a horse. Oh, it's this lot and not this lot in the subdivision. You kind of tell them, look, I looked at this really quickly. I really think you should read this or get an attorney to read this. I noticed something that they talked about on page 48, but I don't know if it's been changed over the years. Please reach out to the HOA and find out the true rules. Does that make sense? So I am never the person that wants to read it and tell them what the rule is. But people do that all the time. They want you to just read all the rules and find out if something's allowed or not. I'll check with the HOA for sure if something is allowed, but if it's that important to them, I'll tell them, hey, I called the HOA. They said your dog is just fine, but I want you to follow up and hear from them before our inspection objection and just make sure that they weren't distracted and just talking and weren't listening to what I was asking, that sort of thing. I always want them to hear it from the same person. I just make myself sound kind of stupid and I'd be like, I don't know, maybe I heard it wrong. And I really want you to follow up. I just need to make sure that you hear it too, that kind of thing, to just make sure they did it. And then I would write it down in my, folder to make sure I followed up. Did you call the HOA and ask about the dog? Did you, oh, I forgot. Do you think you could do that by noon tomorrow? Because our inspection objection is at 5 and we really have to get that in. Okay, does the association have money? This is, God, this class always goes on because there's so much to talk about with HOAs. Does the association have money? Again, sorry I keep talking about PERG, but it's interesting. There were a couple examples. Faring Way is in town, Durango, and years ago, 15 years ago, all of a sudden 7 or 8 of the properties went up for sale at the same time. So not that big of a subdivision, 8 go up at the same time. And people said, what is going on over there? It's because they didn't have money in the bank. They didn't have a big reserve. And then all of a sudden they realized, oh, all our stairs are falling apart. Every single person owed like 12 grand. So people were going, not bankrupt, but they were going to foreclose if they couldn't get out of this property. This was not in a great market because all of a sudden this little tiny 1-bedroom condo had to come up with $12,000. So they decided to just sell instead and get it off. So know that sometimes that happens where they have no money in reserve. You got to really look at those numbers and make sure there is enough money in there that they can run their business, the HOA's business, for a while. So keep an eye on that and know that every HOA is different. The other example is up at PERG, 2 HOAs next to each other, and ALS was the one that was run by people who had been on the board since the 1980s, and they wanted low dues. So they always kept the dues really low. And then every single time they needed something to be redone in this old building, the elevator failed. Now they need to repaint. The pool failed. They had to get a new pool, I think. So they kept doing assessments. So it was almost like every year there would be, oh, 2,000 for this, 4,000 for this. So the people got used to it over the years. It's just how it is. So if you were just looking at the HOA fee, you'd say, oh, it's pretty cheap to be there. But then if you thought about it, they were the only ones that didn't have an organized property management group looking over their HOA. And so they had no money in reserve. So those are the kind of things your buyer should look for. And you should advise your buyer to look at their finances. And it's also something an attorney would pick up on. That makes sense? Sky Dancer, here's another example. I had a friend that lived at some condos in town, townhomes in town. And again, I don't mean to just pick on little old ladies, but there was a little old lady that lived in the subdivision. And every time it would snow an inch, she would call the HOA and demand, I am going to turn you in if you don't plow the whole subdivision. And every time they did it, it was like, $400 or something. So you're looking in meeting minutes to see if people are arguing about financials because there's the one owner that keeps making them do something that costs a lot of money. Those are other examples. You're going to pick up on all these things in the minutes. Tell your buyers to look at the meeting minutes. Tell them to talk to an owner in the subdivision. Talk to the HOA. Sure, the HOA person might be like, oh yeah, it's great here. I love being on the HOA. See if there's another owner they know that they could talk to about what it's like to live in the subdivision. Just like they said on the video, super important. Driving by to get a feel. I always told my people, especially if it was like a condo or a townhome where you're real close to everybody, drive by on Friday night, Saturday night, see if you hear a lot of noise, see if there's parties, see how parking is on weekends, see if it would be easy to find a parking spot. If it's not, they should feel good about it. If you're having trouble getting information from an HOA, if people aren't calling you back, it's kind of a red flag. Like if they don't mind that, that's fine. But if they want to be in a place where they're getting service, you just have to know whatever you're experiencing while you're under contract, you're going to probably get while you live there. And always tell your people, the best way to change things is to try to be involved in your HOA. So if you have like first time buyers, you can always say it's a great opportunity to get involved in the HOA. It's always people that don't want to be, I don't want to be on my HOA board. I'll tell you that much. I would love to hand it over to somebody else, but out of 12 owners, there's only me and Dad that actually wanted to raise our hand. Here's another red flag. Loans for things that have already been done. There's a place that does that on Florida Road. I remember seeing they had put a new roof in and they paved their parking lot and they had no money in reserve. So they got a loan. So they thought they were being real smart because they didn't have an assessment. But what is that like to pay for something that is, they were going to put it over 10 years, got a new roof. The roofs last 20 years, I don't know, 30 years. And then they were going to be paying for it for 10 years. So if there's a loan, I don't know. I don't think that's kind of a red flag to me that they didn't have the money to do it. And then what happens when they have to repaint or they have to put new steps in for the people? Are they gonna just keep getting loans? And these aren't reasons not to buy a condo. It's just to be aware because nobody likes surprises. I lived in a subdivision forever and ever that had no road agreement. So if you're getting a loan, I have no idea what the rules are now, but if you're getting a loan, especially if it's like USDA or somewhere where it's very little amount down, it used to be that you couldn't get those kind of loans or any loans sometimes if there wasn't a road agreement. So know that there are places that are way out there that have never had a road agreement. So be aware of that because that never came up till it was pretty much time to close. And the lender would say, oh yeah, do you have a road agreement? And it would be a no-go if they didn't. So yeah, how would you remember that? I guess if you're on the buyer side, I would just be aware. And if you're on the seller side, if there's no road agreement and the person says, oh, I just take care of it. I have a bulldozer and I just plow people out, and say, do you have anything in writing from your owners? Oh, they just give me $25 every now and then. Be aware that that could be a lending problem. I have no idea if that's still a problem or not, but it was when I used to sell. Give people a whole week, attorney, how to check in with the buyers. Oh yeah, and I'll check in with them. You were going to get an attorney or they weren't going to get an attorney. They want to take a night to think about it. I check in with them in the morning. Did you guys talk about it? What are you going to do? And then did you look at the association documents? And then I might check in the next day, or I might wait 2 days. It just depends. Are they going out of town for a couple of days? I'll wait till like noon the day they get back and say, hey, could you kind of try to look at those HOA docs? I want to make sure you're ready to go. So I'm going to check in with them. I'm not like a pest about it, but I want to make sure that I'm really checking in, and always the night before the deadline, not the day of the deadline, never the day of the deadline. The night before, say, okay, tomorrow is the last night for HOA docs. You have to look at them tonight. We can ask for more time, but we already took a week. So we really want to get this nipped in the bud. So I just want to be pushing them to make sure they get it. And then I'm trying to be helpful. So anything I can put on, it's called association documents in Paragon or whatever system you're on, you're going to want to put as much of the HOA docs on there so that if somebody has a question about the HOA, maybe what kind of things would be interesting to be on there. I think like meeting minutes would be great, that somebody could look at meeting minutes. If there was any sort of documentation that somebody might look at, like I'm not going to go look at, I don't know, would I look at the bylaws to a subdivision? If you're skimming it and you go, oh, if I was a buyer, I might want this, then just stick it on association documents, or maybe just put it all on there as one big long document. I wouldn't be putting covenants on there. It's a brand new subdivision and you have one document that is covenants, then sure, I'll put that on there. But if it's a 1980s subdivision, I don't want to go putting covenants on there, because what if I have part of it and there's like an amendment that I didn't see? So unless you know you have the whole thing, be really careful. I used to do that all the time, just sticking up. We had a whole file of documents and covenants for subdivisions because it was hard to get that stuff. But now that it's all online, like Emmy said, I'd probably just put the link and say all the information about this HOA is right here with covenants and everything else you might want to know, especially like how much it costs to be in the subdivision. That's really important to have on there. And know that just because oh, yeah.
That's a good question. So you said that you typically put the onus on the buyer to figure out what those restrictions are. But if you have someone that says, I'm looking for a property where I can have 3 horses, like what can you find for me? And that kind of requires you to dig into
that does. That's different.
Time. So is that like a phone call to the different HOAs?
It is before I know, yes, it might be, but it would really be to the listing agents of the property in the MLS, because I would not get in my car unless I knew for sure that they could have those 3 horses. I don't want to waste my time. So I would rather sit in the office for 15 minutes for half an hour and try to dig on some different properties than getting into my car for one property and spending an hour and a half with somebody and then having to make the call. So I love doing that kind of research, and I will do that to make sure. Shenandoah is a big one where, you know, part of the subdivision you can do X, but if you're right over here, you might be able to do Y, but then you need exactly, I love it. The way they write it is, I do love it. It'll say, you can have 1 horse for every X number of acres. So you can actually calculate it and say, okay, and then you check with the HOA and say, this is what I read. I'm just making sure I see this right because they have 3 horses. Yeah, I'll totally do that. That's a great question. Okay, know that just because your HOA allows you to do things, you have city codes and county codes. So somebody might say, I want to build a tiny home. And you say, oh, great. Well, this subdivision, there's nothing that says you can't do it. But then you find out, well, there's a septic code that says you need at least this many acres, and then you have to do this, and you can't drill a well. And oh, and in Durango city limits, you can't have a tiny home. But if you were outside of La Plata County, in Montezuma County, they let you do X. So don't think that an HOA is the only thing you can do. And HOAs might specifically say you can do something that the state or the county or the some sort of code has not allowed you to do anymore, you know? So if you're reading it in the old covenants that you're allowed to put a house right up to the road, and then yes, CDOT now has a 100-foot easement on that road. No, there's all sorts of layers. So there's no one place in real estate that you can read everything and know, I am now an expert in what goes on in this subdivision. It's complicated, more complicated than that. But that's all I got. Any other questions?
No, that's really good. I think that like the example you said about the tiny home, if somebody wanted to put a tiny home in, just knowing which calls you even need to make. Like the HOA says it's okay.
That's the hardest thing.
Should I call the city or the county before I go show that property? Because may or may not, or just say, here's a lot, but you need to make all these calls to determine if you could do it. Like, where do you draw the line?
I do it. I do a lot of those things for them. And then I find out what the answer is. And then I have them call the same person. And then I explain my process to the person so that they understand, okay, I started with this, then I went to this, because you also want them to know you're really working for them. But you're going to start knowing certain things. Someone comes in on floor and they say, I'm going to put a tiny home and I'm going to go up to Engineer Village by PERG. And you know in your head that the minimum square footage, it doesn't say in the covenants what it is, but you know that the design and review board has never allowed a home under 1,800 square feet. So even though the buyer is saying, hey, I read in the covenants that I'm allowed to do this, you have known from doing all that research in the past. So any time that you spend doing research now, you will never waste it. Unless, you know, like sometimes you have somebody on a pot farm and you're like, oh, great, like I'm never going to use this again. But for the most part, like irrigation, all these things that people need, that's another one where I have 3 horses, and then, oh, this has irrigation. But then you make some phone calls and you realize, oh, their irrigation starts in June and it ends at the end of June. Like you have 20 shares of nothing except for 1 month. So you just have to really research, and irrigation is one, well, my God, a rabbit hole, because there's so many ditches and like priorities. And so you just do the best you can. And then I always try to know as many people as I can, so I can call that person at the city and say, I know it's not in your department. Planning is a great place to call up the city or the county and just say, hey, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I know this isn't your department, but who would I call about X? And they will say, oh, that's on page 22 of the other county's code. Just look there. Like, they happen to know things and they know people you can call, but it'll save you a little bit of time. So even if you know that this isn't the right person, it might be somebody that knows the knowledge other than a realtor. Title companies are great. City people, like the asbestos thing I was talking about yesterday. It was really hard to get information on that, but just keep trying to reach out to enough people that or if you just reach a dead end, you just tell the people, I am so sorry, but I cannot figure out who to call. Do you have any ideas? So I've done that before too.